Apologies for the delay, everyone. Hello, my name is Nicole Allen, and I will be moderating today's media availability with Environment and Climate Change Canada experts David Phillips, Senior Climatologist, and Chantal McCartan, Physical Science Specialist. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from unceded Algonquin territory. Please note that the English presentation will be given by Mr. Phillips and the French presentation by Ms. McCartan, which will occur simultaneously. This Zoom will be presented in English only. To access the French Zoom, please consult the email confirmation that was provided upon registering for the event. A bilingual Q&A period will follow the presentation. Veuillez noter que Monsieur Phillips présentera en anglais et Mademoiselle McCartan en français. Les présentations se dérouleront simultanément. Ce Zoom sera présenté uniquement en anglais. Pour accéder au Zoom en français, veuillez consulter le courriel de confirmation qui vous a été fourni lors de votre inscription à l'événement. Une période de questions bilingues suivra la présentation. I would like to make a few quick points before the presentation begins. Just before David Phillips begins his presentation, you will see a starting soon screen for approximately 30 seconds. Please do not disconnect from the Zoom call. After the event has concluded, you will see the Government of Canada wordmark. This will be followed by a 30 to 60-second pause to allow the stream to disconnect. Reporters should remain on the line. Shortly after, we will announce that the media Q&A period will begin. To be called upon, we ask that you make sure your name and your media outlets are clearly identified in your Zoom name. I will now pass it over to David Phillips to present Canada's top 10 weather stories of 2023.
Thank you, Nicole. You know, I've been researching Canada's top 10 weather stories now for 28 years, and it's kind of customary before you begin the countdown from number 10 to number 1 is to make a few comments about the year in question. And for me, this was the year the Canadian landscape took a real hit from extreme weather and from climate-related disasters. You've seen the scenes. I mean, it's scorched earth and charred buildings and smoking tree trunks, debris flows everywhere from major storms, dried riverbeds, fields and neighborhoods underwater for long periods of time, and that hellish, orange, hazy sky that seemed to permeate the air in Canada for so long. This is what climate change looks like, and it's not pretty. I mean, there were no province or territory that was immune, no Canadians untouched from the extreme weather of this year. And I tend to agree with the majority of Canadians when they say that they have witnessed, they have seen the fallout and impacts from human-caused climate change. It used to be a northern thing, an Arctic thing, skinny polar bears and disappearing ice and the melting permafrost. But now it's occurring in our backyards, in our neighborhoods. I was shocked this year by the number of evacuations. A 250,000 Canadians had to leave their homes, and sometimes on 2 or 3 occasions because of smoke and fires and floods. I mean, I've never been evacuated for any reason, but I can imagine, or can I, about the anguish and the stress that it is for people to, like the people in Yellowknife who had to be taken 2,000 kilometers away to Winnipeg and wondering if their possessions or their property would be intact when they return. Canada was hot this year, but the world was hotter. And in fact, the record hot. And in fact, the oceans around bathing Canada on 3 coasts, I've never seen it so warm, so hot, that water. I think this year was interesting because of the attention that the world gave to Canada because of the extreme weather. And not because of a curiosity, it's because it meant something to their lives and their health. I think in many ways this year will be sort of a dress rehearsal of what we see more often in the future. So hey, it was a punishing year for Canada, a destructive and expensive year, probably will cost the economy billions of dollars. So hey, so let's begin with the number 10 story. Canada Day tornado in Alberta. You know, we're still counting tornadoes. We have last count 85, which is a few more than we've seen in the last 3 years, but about normal. Ontario had almost half of those 85 tornadoes, and Saskatchewan sometimes can lead the the country in tornadoes, had one weak one. The most powerful tornado occurred in Alberta on July the 1st, about 70 kilometers north of Calgary. And a weather system in the foothills developed into a supercell thunderstorm, spawned a tornado with winds of 275 kilometers per hour. In a scale from 0 to 5, it registered an EF4. It's one of the more powerful ones in Canada, and certainly the most powerful one we've seen in Alberta since the Edmonton Killer tornado 35 years ago. The damage was unbelievable. It debarked trees. We saw farm machinery weighing 10,000 kilograms picked up like Tonka toys and tossed into the fields. Well-established homes, these aren't trailers, well-established homes, about 12 or so were demolished or made unlivable. A lot of damage, crop damage, and the storm actually went the next day into Saskatchewan, not as a tornado, but microbursts and strong winds and hail, and did over $100 million of damage. The number 9 storm or event this year flooded out Quebec's record wet July. It was wet in the province of Quebec this year, wet summer, but a particularly wet July. From the Gatineau to Montreal and Sherbrooke, Quebec City to the Saguenay, we saw rain in July. It was 2 to 3 times what it would normally would be. It wasn't from tropical storms. It was just from tropical moisture and embedded thunderstorms that just hung out for almost day after day. July 1st, there was the torrential downpour in Saguenay, caused some highways to be flooded out, and sadly led to the death of 2 people. The most powerful storm occurred July the 10th, 11th, maybe the 12th, when you had 80 in Sherbrooke and in Montreal, 80 millimeters of rain in 2 hours. I mean, not many cities can handle that amount of rain. In Sherbrooke, the Saint Francois River, which cuts through the city, it rose 6 meters in 4 hours. I mean, it's the most swelled river there in the warm season ever. In Montreal, there were about 6 underpasses flooded. Highways, expressways were closed in both directions. You had motorists being rescued because water rising up to their waists. Water entered, flood waters entered the metro system and buildings. And out in the farm fields, it was just devastating for farmers. They just were drenched and swamped by all of this of the water. So about a $300 million damage from that particular event. Power outages. It was really a nasty storm with more storms to come. I mean, we were just talking about the middle of the month and the following 2 weeks. By the end of the month of July, Quebec City, Montreal, Sherbrooke had their wettest July in 150 years of weather records. Number 8, cold spells in a warm year. You know, this will come out to be a warm year in Canada. Probably the 19th consecutive warmer than normal year. And I think about in 76 years of national record keeping, probably the 3rd warmest. We have to see what the data gives us in the end of December, but the 2nd or 3rd warmest year on record. But you just knew there were going to be some cold moments. La Nina appeared for the 3rd consecutive year. And you remember a year ago, my gosh, it was one of the coldest beginnings, days before Christmas and after Christmas, I mean, right across the country. I mean, travel was restricted, planes couldn't fly in and out, thousands of Canadians' holiday plans were ruined because of the cold, the ice rain, the blizzard kind of conditions. Hey, this year we're worrying about a white Christmas. Last year, it was about seeing grandma. I mean, it was just not possible. And then a new year, a new month, and new weather. January came and it was like a January thaw right across the country, a protracted January thaw. Yet in the middle of the month, that dreaded polar vortex began to wiggle and wobble in the stratosphere. And 10 days later, it usually takes 2 weeks, that cold came down to the surface, spread out west and into the east, and Canada was gripped in one of the coldest moments they've seen in generations. Temperature, wind chills, -55, -60. The impacts were obvious. I mean, utilities couldn't keep up with the power demand. You had in shelters and food banks were absolutely crowded. So were hospitals with people with frostbite and hypothermia. Driving was treacherous and dangerous. In Ottawa, there was excitement because the ice could start finally growing. The first week of February, you had temperatures of -33, -44 wind chill, and you had 6 of the 7 days had temperatures below -20. The ice was growing feverishly on the Rideau Canal. The next week, following the coldest week of the winter, came the warmest week. Temperatures went up to 10 degrees every day, but one was a melting day. It was over. For the first time in 53 years, you could not go skating on the Rideau Canal. The cold continued. March and April out west, never been so cold. In Winnipeg, for example, they've been 150 years of record. They've never had a March without a melting temperature, except this year, when morning, noon, and night, it was below freezing. And in Vancouver and the lower mainland, boy, winter really went on long. A cold and treachery and chaos because of snow and cold. And then on April the 2nd, it snowed in Vancouver, which made 6 consecutive months of snow in Vancouver. It was kind of a warm moment for the rest of Canada when we saw what that happened to the lower mainland. Number 7 event this year, the April glaze storm in Montreal, Ottawa, more beast than beauty. Nothing strikes fear in Montrealers and Ottawa residents than to hear that ping, ping, ping of ice rain or ice pellets bouncing off window panes. And add to that the sound of thunderstorm outside, and there was real weather worry. That it was the 25th anniversary of the infamous ice storm of 1998, well, it brought people to their knees. April the 5th, a few days before Easter, a powerful storm came in to Ontario, Quebec. In southwestern Ontario, there were tornado watches. There were weather warnings of flooding from rains, heavy rains falling on frozen ground, of snow, of ice rain, of thunder snows. And in Ottawa, Montreal, the air was very cool in the valleys, and the warm rains falling through it produced ice. Anywhere from 25 to 35 millimeters of ice accretion, about 9 to 12 hours of ice. You know, a million people lost power in Quebec at the time of the storm, 200,000 in eastern Ontario. Every surface, steps and stairways and roads and expressways were just ice covered. And the next day, the power continued to be out, but there was another sound that you heard. It was the crashing sheets of ice coming off roofs and balconies and wires and trees. I mean, Montreal lost 300 trees in that particular ice storm. And so that sound was another one that really was indicative of what a rapid change, because the temperatures went from -3 to +9. And so the ice actually melted. Sadly, 2 deaths from asphyxiation and tree falling limbs on people in Quebec. And it cost, expensive storm, 2 days, $330 million in property losses from Sarnia to the Saguenay. Number 6 storm this year, Hurricane Lee, no Fiona, but more than a windy day. I mean, forecasters had kind of 2 hurricane forecasts this year. At the beginning, they said it was going to be quieter than the last 6 years, kind of normal to quiet, because of El Nino, the emergence of El Nino, which tends to kind of shear off the tops of thunderstorms in the Atlantic Ocean, and they can't develop into the monster storms of being hurricanes. But in the middle of August, they changed their mind. It was no longer El Nino being sort of a dampening effect, it was the hot water of the oceans, jet fuel for these storms. And so we ended up with 20 named storms, normally be about 14, 15, so hey, it was a more active situation. We had 3 major storms, and 2 of them entered Canadian water. They were diffused, but they still began as major storms. Hurricane Franklin did kind of a couple of nasty days in St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador, some winds, but just at the end of August, sort of a nasty day, but not a hurtful kind of a period. But Hurricane Lee in the middle of September really worried forecasters because it was one of the more powerful hurricanes in history. And it was the third most rapidly developing one. It went from nothing to a category 5, the top of the rung, to a 3 in one day. That was a fish storm. It stayed out of the water until it got to Canada. And it made landfall in the Bay of Fundy, it was fairly large storm. You had tropical storm warnings out to 500 kilometers. So not many maritimes missed the effects of Lee, from tree felling winds to heavy rain, surf, and wave heights of maybe up to 16 meters. And the damage was mostly to the coastal of Nova Scotia. The precious beaches and parks and playgrounds were eroded. A lot of beaches were destroyed in that particular event. I've got to mention Hillary, kind of as an oddity of storm. It was a hurricane born in the Pacific, near Baja State in Mexico. It came in and flooded the driest area of North America, in Las Vegas and San Diego and California. Came north into Canada, brought some helpful rains to the fire-scarred area of the eastern British Columbia, didn't kind of reach the Okanagan, went over to the prairies and brought some beneficial rains to the drought going on there in the prairies. And then 2 days later, moved into Ontario, merged with another storm, and dropped two months of rain in 2 days, flooding and sewer backups, and led to the death of a motorist. The number 5 story this year: Canada dry in the west and wet in the east. You know, sometimes the weather reminds me what a huge country we have as in Canada. Seldom is the weather the same from coast to coast. And this year it was the sort of the warm season rains that reminded me how huge we are. But the first 5 months were pretty well the same across the country. We had widespread places like Lethbridge and Winnipeg and the North Shore of Quebec. I mean, it had one of their driest 5 months in 100 years. And potato growers in Prince Edward Island were saying, my gosh, we're doing more irrigation in May than we would normally do in July. Well, it stayed dry out west the whole year. And this was really almost 2 or 3 years of dryness in British Columbia, particularly in the Okanagan, about half the normal precipitation. The impacts were devastating to farmers. Ranchers had to sell their cattle because they didn't have the hay to feed them. You couldn't produce power like you used to. The fish was toxic to fish. I mean, the hot waters, the oxygen-starved waters, it was just lethal. And even in the Northwest Territories, I mean, transportation, barging wouldn't happen. And it was the expensive way you have to transport by trucks or airplanes for merchandise and people and what have you. In the west or in the east, it started raining in June and you couldn't turn the faucet off. All summer, very hugely wet in eastern Canada. I think and cities were competing with one another as who was the wettest. Well, I think the gold medal goes to St. John, New Brunswick. They had 700 plus millimeters of rain, normally 250, something like that, 3 times almost what they normally would get, and heavy rains. When it rained, it would rain hard. 3 days where we get maybe 25 millimeters of rain on a day, like in 3 days in the summer, they had 11 of those. So it was clearly, and farmers were devastated in Ontario and Quebec particularly. Every time they'd wait for it to dry out, then they'd go out and it would rain again. And it cost, when you look at just the property loss from storms, not crops, but property loss, it amounted to $750 million in Eastern Canada because of the kind of wet summer. Number 4, the deadly deluge in Nova Scotia. If you thought the weather was bad where you lived, shed a tear for the good folk of Nova Scotia. They had it tough. A year ago, they had Fiona, the #1 story in Canada, with the most powerful, destructive hurricane ever. And then a year later, they had Hurricane Lee. And I told you about Lee. 4 months before Lee, they had the most devastating, widespread fire in their history. 18,000 people had to be evacuated. 50 times the area burnt than was last year. And then it started raining, squelched the flames, but it wouldn't stop raining. And then on July the 20th and 21st, you had the wettest moment in Halifax in 50 years. It just rained 28 hours of 10 hours of thunderstorms, 23,000 lightning strikes. My gosh, it was a record. And of course, the damage was unbelievable. And the heartache was even worse. I mean, 4 deaths, including 2 small children, and bridges taken out, roads. I mean, whether they ever get repaired is a question. And so it just was absolutely wet. Nova Scotia is the wettest province in Canada on average. Well, it proved itself once again this year. Number 3 story this year in Canada, the hottest summer on Earth and in Canada. I mean, the words I kept hearing this year was baking and bristling and broiling and hellish temperatures on Earth. And that was because the world had gone through their warmest summer since 1800, and some have suggested since the last 120,000 years. Mark this day, July the 7th, the warmest day in human history on planet Earth. Now, Canada was also warm. We fed to that warmth. Stick a thermometer into Canada and said, well done. We had the warmest summer in 76 years of record keeping. But even more spectacular for me was, sometimes you can get a national record, but none of the parts are record. Come close to it, but not quite there. Well, from May to September, 5 months, we had the warmest such period in Canada in 76 years, and every province and territory had their warmest, except in Atlantic Canada. They were too busy being wet to be hot. And so it was warm in the north. I mean, hot in the north. I mean, at the Arctic Circle, there were a couple of places that almost reached 38 degrees, about 0.1, 0.2 less than 38. If it had reached 38, it would have been the warmest moment on planet Earth so far north. But try telling people in Montreal, and Ottawa, and Toronto that it was a hot summer. And yet those are just pinpricks on the maps of Ontario and Quebec. Those provinces were the warmest, but not in those cities. In fact, there was a period there from mid-July to Labor Day when those cities didn't get a temperature above 30 degrees. That's my definition of summer. And there was no summer there. But what was kind of strange, though, it wasn't intensely hot, but it was long hot. It started 30 degrees in April, May, June, July, nothing in August. And then the sizzling September came with more days above 30. And then also the dog days of summer came back in October. So really it was a long summer, but not intensely hot. And I think, just as an aside, doesn't appear in the report, but the warmth has continued. I counted the number of days from mid-October to now of breaking daily records in all of Canada, and I've stopped counting after about 550 records of warm daily temperatures in Canada. How many cold records? None. Number 2, Canada cloaked in smoke. Very few people saw the flames this year in Canada, but millions and millions of Canadians smelled the smoke and tasted and felt the ashes falling from those massive fires. Say, 250,000 people evacuated, and a lot because of fires. I mean, the territory, 2/3 of the people in the Northwest Territories left home. I mean, it was just mind-boggling. Record fires, of course, led to record plumes of smoke across North America. I mean, just ask 100 million Americans what they were smelling this year, and read those, the weather slurs from New York City about where this was coming from. From Greenland to Germany, the same thing. Everybody was smelling Canadian smoke. And that was the disbelief around the world. These smoky, polluted skies were coming from Canada, where the air is so polished and scrubbed and clean. And so that was a bewilderment. And Canadian cities, many of them, competed for the most polluted city in the world. Calgary and Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto at times, and it was, and the impacts were great, concerning. I mean, when school was in, recess was canceled, very few recreational programs were on. Even crops wouldn't grow because sun couldn't get through the smoke at times. And the number of hours of smoke, it's just mind-boggling. You had over 1,000 hours in northern Saskatchewan, northern British Columbia. Major cities like Kamloops and Edmonton, and Regina, Saskatoon, and even Ottawa, quite 200 hours, but in those other places, 200 hours of smoke. In Calgary, I used to live in Calgary, and you could see the mountains from your front window. You couldn't see across the street. They had 506 hours of smoke and haze, normal 6. And so we really don't know the health effects of what that's going to be. The long-term effects. The number 1 story, there's no drum roll required. You already know it. I mean, I've hinted at it. Too hot, too dry, too smoky. It was the year for record wildfires. And to me, in the years I produced top 10 weather stories, this is the most obvious number one. National, it affected millions of Canadians, had an international flavor to it, but the numbers are just mind-boggling. The area burned. 5% of our precious boreal forests disappeared in smoke. We had, the area burned. We could take over half the countries in the world could fit in that area and still have scarred, burnt area left over. Take all the fires, the woodland burned in the United States over the last 5 years, and you could still have, that still wouldn't equate to what we burnt this year in Canada. I mean, 2.5 times the previous worst year, 7 times the 10-year average. The fires came early, stayed late, were monster sizes, little guys that would just blossom overnight into a burning inferno. And across Canada, fires were everywhere. And that was the difference this year. You were fighting fires in the west, the north, and the east, sometimes all at once. June the 6th, there were out of control fires in every province and territory except Prince Edward Island and Nunavut. How do you move men and women and machinery and hoses when you're dealing with fire fronts in so many areas? And certainly weather was a cause. It was really just too hot, too windy, too dry, too long. And lightning, well, it was actually down this year, but just shows you it. I mean, the fire in British Columbia, the biggest fire, I'm trying to see if I can remember the name of it. I think it was the Donnie Creek fire, the largest fire, the burnt more area. It was started with just a couple of lightning strikes. Yeah, we had 3.3 million lightning strokes in Canada from cloud to ground, but you don't need to have a lot of lightning to cause fires. So there you have it, the top 10 weather stories for 2023. Let me just make some final kind of concluding remarks. I think, given the year we've had, I think scientists are confident what we saw this year in terms of weather extremes would not have been possible in total without human-caused climate change. And as our climate continues to warm at the hands of human beings, I think we should expect to see more wildfires, larger and burning more area, and lasting, not just a hot summer, but a year, possibly. We have seen longer droughts and lasting multi-years, so not just during the growing season. And so that is something that I think is in the cards. More intense killer heat waves lasting weeks, not days. And like we saw this year, covering, three continents wide. And likely to see more frequent and severe, rapidly intensifying storms, not just in the oceans, but elsewhere, that explode overnight and hard to respond to it. So I think the evidence is clear and consistent and more certain that human-caused climate change is making weather extremes more extreme and leading to more catastrophes, both at home and abroad. Climate change is not just about the dramatic and the spectacular, like as presented by the top 10 weather stories, but it's also about the gradual, the subtle, the slow-moving, the kind of relentless, sneak up on you kind of event. Events like, hey, gee, we're seeing more brown Christmases than white Christmases, or I'm spending, as much on my air conditioning as my home heating, or my gosh, the skating and the ski season is much shorter now than when I was a child. I mean, sometimes we don't have a season at all. But I think climate change is, yes, it's about the extremes, and that's important, but it's also about variability, these wild swings. Well, it's harder to express variability, but it's like seeing one extreme back to back. It's like, it's just how do you deal with that? Because in the past, it used to be an extreme and then separated by decades of normal weather. You just don't seem to get normal weather anymore. So I think climate change is about the rare becoming the frequent. It's about the extraordinary becoming the ordinary. And I think, though, it will be hard to forget what has happened this year from the weather in Canada. And I think it will be even harder to ignore that our fingerprints weren't all over it. Thank you so much. I appreciate your interest and attention, and I'd be pleased to answer your questions in a few minutes.